Hi, I'm Allison Eyring, CEO of Organization Solutions and an adjunct professor at the NUS Business School. It's my pleasure to be here with Piyush Gupta, CEO of DBS Bank. DBS is Southeast Asia's largest bank and one of Asia's leading global financial services groups. Piyush, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You are an eclectic leader who's lived in many countries. You've lived in London and Hong Kong, Malaysia, Indonesia, here in Singapore. Describe for me first some of the differences that you see in the way people lead within the different markets of Asia.
And first of all, I think the core tenets of leadership are pretty consistent. You got to be able to set strategy, get strategic alignment, motivate and create and motivate a team of people and so on. So the fundamentals don't change. The biggest differences I've seen are actually between India and the rest of East Asia. So I think it's really a cultural nuance between the Indian culture and the Chinese culture. The Indian culture tends to be a little more like the West. It's a little more direct. You can tell people straight to their face what you want or don't want. You can scold somebody publicly. It's not a big deal. As you move further out into the more eastern parts of Asia, that is a very big deal. So you have to be a lot more thoughtful, a lot more diplomatic about how you say things and phrase things.
What would you say are some of the key differences between leadership styles you see in the East and the West?
So in my experience, leaders in the West are a lot more planned and a lot more orchestrated about creating strategies. Leaders in the East often tend to be a little more opportunistic. So they're a lot more focused on being able to think about where is the next opportunity coming from and how do we quickly respond to a short-term opportunity. In the East, I find a lot of leaders are willing to really think long-term. And they're willing to think long-term because many leaders either are owner entrepreneurs, they own their own business empires, or a lot of capital, estate capital. So people are not necessarily managing for the quarter, which means that they're happy to be able to look at long-term consequences of their decisions. In the West, conversely, people are typically very focused on short-term deliverables and short-term results. And therefore, the ability to really build long-term strategies and long-term agendas tends to get compromised. One of the difference in the context of strategy setting, I find in the East, by and large, leaders in setting strategy really have to think about multiple stakeholder requirements. Society at large has an expectation that companies perform to expectations which are broader than shareholder returns. In the West, a large part of the focus in recent years has been shareholder dominated.
It sounds like that is something that the West could learn from the East, is about attending to multiple stakeholder needs.
I would agree with that. And frankly, I think in the context of the global financial crisis, that is indeed a lesson the West is adapting to. That you cannot just be driven by shareholder profit motive. You have to be focused more equally on a responsible corporate community agenda, on your role in society, on governments, on people at large. I think that is something that an adaptation is happening as we speak.
What would you say are some of the differences that you see in terms of the ways that leaders drive high performance within teams in the West versus the East?
In the West, meritocracy gets a lot more focus. So you take the normal curve, right? The GE, Jack Welch sponsored thing of top 10%, next 20, next 30, bottom 10, and a focus on saying, try and get people to stick to a curve, have the bottom 10 leave every year. If you look at Asia, the focus on relentlessly driving out the bottom 10%, nobody in Asia has ever followed it, right? What are the consequences? You get much better teamwork in Asia, and you get better recognition that a company needs to work not just with generals but with soldiers. And so you build a team with soldiers and generals and it's better aligned, right? The downside, you sometimes wind up compromising for mediocrity. So in the interest of harmony and teamwork and making sure everybody has bonhomie, you sometimes wind up with deadwood you shouldn't have in the organization. So once again, you need to get balance, right? I believe in Asia, in the East, leaders need to figure how you get the right tools to make sure you don't wind up in a morass of mediocrity. Equally, I think Western leaders need to recognize that this constant thrust to try and manage performance to the nth degree and get rid of the bottom every time doesn't work in growth markets. In growth markets, you need to build a blended organization which has soldiers.
You spent many years at Citibank before becoming the CEO of DBS. What are some of the differences that you see if you just look at a Western multinational that's in Asia and an Asian multinational that's growing externally?
I found DBS culture had a big positive and a big negative relative to where I was coming from. The positive was around teamwork. I found that people in DBS were less silo-oriented, and so it was far more harmonious culture. On the other hand, I found that the culture I was used to at Citi was a lot more entrepreneurial, a lot more individual-driven, greater focus on individual accountability. So what I'm trying to do at DBS is create a balanced culture. I don't want to compromise on the harmony and teamwork. I think that's really essence of Asia, and that gives us a lot of strength. But at the same time, I'm trying to marry that with a culture which promotes individual accountability, which promotes individual risk-taking, and which promotes, therefore, individual enterprise.
Tell me a little bit about how you're melding this balance of East and West cultures with the values that you're inculcating in DBS.
So I've done a couple of things. One is on the people dimension. I've actively tried to promote a whole range of ambassadors who can buy into what we're trying to create and then be ambassadors of the change and ambassadors of the future culture. A blend between the teamwork, harmony and individual enterprise. Second, we've tried to change the KPIs metrics in the organization so people recognize that it's okay to take some risk and you don't get punished for taking risks if things go wrong. I found two processes really helpful in this regard. One was I created this whole thing which is an immense focus on customer centricity. We created a customer experience council and a customer agenda driven around a value system we call RED. So to be respectful, to be easy and to be dependable. That's mantra around RED has created energy in the organization. You have to be a little more thoughtful, a little more energetic and a little more individually oriented if you want to be RED. So that's been helpful. Second platform I created was around the innovation. So we created an innovation council similarly. And we are pushing in the system the need to think differently about process and to think differently about product. Both platforms have been very helpful in trying to drive this new culture and the new value system that you spoke of.
Piyush, in Singapore we have a lot of leaders coming from the West who will take on regional and global roles. What are some of the challenges they face as leaders in such a multicultural environment?
I'd like to say maybe two challenges. One is about something I talked about briefly earlier. This whole thing about direct versus indirect approaches. Face is a big deal in Asia. And so recognizing that being direct sometimes causes people to lose face and therefore is detrimental to what you're trying to achieve is something a lot of Westerners take time getting used to. The second thing to me is the ability to deal with grays as opposed to blacks and whites. And some of the blacks and whites are culture contextualized. So for me, one specific case in point, giving gifts. In most Western companies, increasingly, giving gifts runs into issues around corrupt practices, perhaps bribery, etc. In the East, giving a hamper at Chinese New Year or giving a hang pao at China, it's expected, right? It's a part of the culture. So how do you deal with grace so you don't compromise on your two principles, but recognize that in different cultures, different things are acceptable is something which a lot of Westerners take time getting used to.
Let's recap some important takeaways from our interviews so far. First, great leadership in Asia requires a balancing act between characteristics of the East and the West. Second, leaders can learn from Asia in taking a longer-term perspective on their business and balancing this with an entrepreneurial spirit with an eye out for new opportunity. And third, leaders everywhere need to derive greater understanding of the expectations and the needs of a broad range of stakeholders. In the second part of the interview, I'm going to ask Piyush to share some of his lessons of experience driving growth.